Hello and welcome to the United States Drought Monitor process webinar. We're glad you could join us today. And before we start, I want to just have everybody introduce themselves in the chat box if they would. Maybe your name and your affiliation would be great. What we're going to do this afternoon is Curtis Riganti, a climatologist with the Drought Center, will give a short presentation on the making of the US Drought Monitor. And as he's presenting, please put any questions you have in the chat box. If you have a question afterwards, we'll try to take some of those as well, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. We will be sending out a question and answer sheet after the webinar and the recording as well. So since you're here today, you are registered and we will send that information out to you. Then the second part of the webinar will be led by Kelly Smith, the Assistant Director at the National Drought Mitigation Center, and she's going to be discussing drought impacts and how you can get involved in reporting them. We are recording this webinar so we can share it on our website and send it out to all of you folks. Okay, with that, I will hand it over to Curtis.
All right, thank you, Tanya, and thank you everyone for being here as part of this webinar today. We'll go ahead and get started. So first off, I'll be talking about the US Drought Monitor and its process, how it's made, what it is, and any other questions you might have on that. So let's go ahead and get started here. I can get this to advance. There we go. Okay, so first, just at least as of a few days ago, we just wanted to give you a general idea who is registered for this conference call here. So this gives you just a geographical idea of both who you all work for or what you do, and then the distribution of where people are located. Okay, so generally speaking, we've been trying to monitor droughts in the United States spatially and in terms of intensity for a really long time. This is an old map from August 1934 back in the Dust Bowl years, looking at drought conditions across the United States. And as you can see here, drought was spelled differently up at the top here. And again, this is a pretty old map. So older maps like this, we tended to show what were some of the impacts from drought, what were some of the main things that we were seeing as impacts in different areas. And what we're trying to show nowadays is more numerically, historically, how severe are different droughts. And so as we move forward in time into the 1980s, it was still challenging to try to show what conditions were like in terms of drought severity, intensity, and coverage over different areas. This map example here is looking at the Palmer Drought Severity Index and descriptions of that plotted over a large geographic area from, this looks like July 1987. So this is a little bit different, that we're looking at a drought statistic that's trying to take into account different measures of drought conditions, looking at different parts of the water cycle. However, this differs from our current approach in that this is one singular drought index. And as we're going to talk about, the current US Drought Monitor approach is trying to look at many different types of drought indices. All right. So this map here looks at the history of the Drought Monitor from the year 2000 through 2021, and wanted to show this to give you an idea of over the last couple decades, generally speaking, and this doesn't have the last 3 years of data, but what are some of the kind of drought hotspots that we've seen over the last couple decades? And as you can see, we have seen a lot of abnormally dry or drought conditions in parts of the western, especially southwest US, and to an extent parts of the High Plains region. And that's kind of what we'd expect over the last couple decades, given the kind of mega drought, as people have called that, over different western parts of the United States. So that does bear out in the Drought Monitor data here over the last few decades. Okay, so for the US Drought Monitor, we're trying to classify drought severity using, as I mentioned before, a large number of drought indicators. And this is blended with subjective interpretation of these drought indicators based on local expertise. So again, we're looking both objectively at drought, basically what are the different drought indices, drought indicators say, and we want to know what people are seeing on a local level and have them help us interpret those different drought indicators and indices combined with local impact reports to come up with a good map depiction each week. And so again, rather than using individual indices like some of those early maps, we're taking a hybrid approach now when trying to depict drought. And so in order to make this process better, it is a continuous development process or kind of a collaborative process where our development team, which is the National Drought Mitigation Center here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, the U.S. Department of Agriculture and NOAA, we're trying to develop the National Drought Monitor, and then we're looking for basically a continuous feedback process where we want feedback from users as in terms of what do they want to see in the product. And from that information, then we can figure out both how to deliver a better product and make the product better over time. So what is the US Drought Monitor exactly? So what we're trying to do with the US Drought Monitor is represent all different types of drought on one map, which can be a little bit difficult in some ways because we're trying to show basically how drought is affecting in different parts of the water cycle. And that can mean that drought can be impacting maybe agriculture, but not long-term hydrology, or maybe you're seeing long-term hydrological and ecological impacts, but maybe the short-term conditions are wet enough that people in the agriculture sector, for instance, won't notice any dryness. So we're not just talking about short-term meteorological or maybe agricultural drought or just long-term drought, especially as it shows itself in ecological or hydrological drought. We're kind of trying to show all of those on one map. So in order to do this, the US Drought Monitor is hosted by the National Drought Mitigation Center as part of a three-way partnership with NOAA and the US Department of Agriculture. So the Drought Monitor is used by all sorts of different users. A few USDA programs, such as the Livestock Forage Disaster Program, the Emergency Assistance for Livestock and Honeybees program, will use the Drought Monitor as triggers for different aid programs. Specifically, if you want any more information about how these different programs work, I'd highly suggest reaching out to your local FSA office when if any questions about that. States also can and do use the Drought Monitor, both in looking at basically historical droughts and incorporating information from those events into their state drought plans. US Drought Monitor could be used to trigger items in state drought plans, for instance, but it is open-ended in terms of how people can use it. It's also used by the IRS for tax deferrals. So. And again, it's a participatory process between the Drought Mitigation Center, USDA, and NOAA. So we all have authors at each of these different shops who are responsible for the map individually each week, but we collaborate with each other on the standards and methodology that we're using when producing the map. So let's take a look at what a typical US Drought Monitor map will look like. So this one is from my coworker, Brian Fuchs here at the National Drought Mitigation Center from mid-July of this year. So this is just before drought coverage really started to blow up over much of the lower 48 states over the last few months. So what you can see on here is really three main things. First, drought extent, then drought extensity, and the relative duration of drought. So in order to see these things, any of the warm colors you see on the map, for anyone here who's unfamiliar with this, those show different levels of intensity of drought, as you can see by these labels over here. And then the spatial coverage of that shows areas that we've identified as being in different levels of severity of drought. Again, the warmer colors show more unusual dryness for those particular areas and therefore more severe drought by definition. You can also see the relative duration of drought, which you can sometimes infer from that maybe the types of impacts you could be seeing. And so those you can see with these solid thick black lines here and the letters on the map. So for instance, the area here in Arizona and New Mexico enclosed by this thick black line with an L in the middle of it, that means that Brian had put this area in long-term drought. So basically most of the indicators and indices and impacts that we're seeing in this area were primarily indicative of long-term, so generally 6 months or longer types of drought impacts and data. Whereas maybe some of these areas in Tennessee and parts of the Appalachian Mountains, these are more short-term type of drought impacts. And so these are delineated again by these thick black lines. If you don't see any of those lines, then any area covered by an S or an L without the lines, that just covers the whole area enclosed by the color you see on the map. You can also have areas that have both short and long-term impacts. As you can see, that's the case in parts of the High Plains and Southern Great Plains here in Oklahoma, Texas, and Southwest Kansas. So in order to assign categories, what we're doing is we're using a percentile approach to this. So the advantages of using percentile, you can apply percentiles to any parameter or drought index that we use for analysis. And so regardless of the length of your data record, you can assign percentiles to any data that's currently in time. So for instance, if I wanted to know what the current precipitation over the last couple months is in a location, say Norman, Oklahoma, I could look at the last 3 months of precipitation in Norman and then compare that to all, if I can do math here, September, October, November precipitation in Norman over their historical record. And from that, then I'd get a percentile of the last 3 months of precipitation there versus everything in the historical record. The longer historical record you have, the more robust those percentiles are going to be in terms of putting data in their historical perspective. Percentiles also then give you some idea of a recurrence interval or how many expected occurrences you could have for both the wet and dry side of data in a given period of time. And so again, each of these drought monitor categories here, and with the warmer colors being by definition rare drought, align with specific ranges of percentiles. So our D0 level, abnormal dryness, we don't technically consider that drought. That represents areas going into or coming out of drought. That represents the 21st through the 30th percentile. And then as you go progressively rarer dryness levels, you have moderate drought lines with the 11th to 20th percentile, severe drought, the 6th through 10th, extreme drought, the 3rd through 5th, and exceptional drought, the 1st through 2nd. So again, I really want to drive home that when you're looking at the drought monitor map, what you're seeing is drought severity really expressed by definition by how rare a drought event is for a particular area for that time of year. And that's all driven by the percentiles of the different types of water cycle data sets that we're looking at as authors. So again, this kind of just repeats what we were talking about the last couple slides, and then, pardon me, that was not, did not mean to go forward another slide there. So I want to just run through quickly the frequency that you'd expect to see some of these levels. So usually you'll see areas in abnormal dryness, maybe once every 3 to 5 years, moderate drought, once every 5 to 10 years, severe, maybe a once to 10 to 20 year event. Extreme drought is a once to 20 to 50 year event, and exceptional drought, again, is a once or twice or 50 to 100 year type of event. So again, progressively rare the more severe drought levels you go through. So to give an example of what this looks like based on some of the type of input data we use, again, we're looking really for historical context when we're looking at percentiles. So I don't know which specific weather station these data are taken from, but let's say that we have a station that has 100 years of ranked data. For the sake of discussion, let's say that we based a drought monitor category only on yearly precipitation. That's obviously not the case. We're looking at a ton of different indices and indicators. But if we wanted one specific thing to assign a drought monitor category, it would be the 1950 and 2020 years would get the D4 level, because these were the two lowest precipitation years out of 100 years of data. Your D3 percentile 3-yearly precipitation would be this 1934, 2020, 2012, and 1956. As we go so on, again, we're identifying basically yearly precipitation in this sense. But you can port this to any sort of index or indicator that we're looking at based on how does the current data compare to the historical data record, specifically in terms of its percentile. So then in order to combine all of this information, what we really need to do is have a convergence of evidence. So by convergence of evidence, what we mean is what are different physical indicators at different points in the water cycle converging on in terms of a drought severity level. So when we talk about that, that's a principle that we use in science generally that says whenever we have multiple sources, multiple different types of angles looking at a problem that come to more or less the same conclusion, we can more confidently assign an analysis of what's going on there. So in terms of drought, when we're trying to assign severity levels based on percentiles, when assigning categories, we want to see that really most percentiles are lining up to a particular percentile range in order to assign the associated category to that. Oftentimes you're going to get kind of mixed messages from that. So that can be a bit challenging in some areas. But really, again, we're looking for most, or at the very least, a plurality or kind of a convergence of evidence when we're doing that. That's made more challenging also by the different types of drought that we're trying to depict on the map. Again, you can have flash drought, short-term meteorological drought, that then cascades to slightly longer-term agricultural drought that'll have negative impacts on soil moisture, growing different types of crops, vegetation health, and then that proceeds downstream as you go look at longer term types of data to how that's impacting maybe groundwater, reservoir levels, long-term ecological health. And so that's why we're also showing the short, long, or short and long-term labels on the map. And so again, when we're trying to look at these different types of droughts, we really need to look at different types of data sets too. So we're looking at precipitation statistics, different observed and modeled soil moisture. We're looking at groundwater measurements and groundwater models from products such as NASA GRACE. We're looking at reservoir levels. We're looking at stream flow, evaporative demand models, and satellite estimates of vegetation health. So, and there are a bunch of different, both in situ and remotely sensed data products that we are looking at as Drought Monitor authors to try to, again, take a multifaceted and convergent approach when trying to assign different categories. And so all these different data sets go into assigning a category. So did also mention impacts. So those alone will not change the map because the map is based on what the range of percentiles of these different physical indices and indicators are showing. However, drought impacts can help first bring an author's attention to a specific area. Maybe if a lot of impacts of a certain type are being reported by people, then maybe we'll have a better idea of what are some indices and indicators that we should be starting with. For instance, if an area is reporting a lot of vegetation issues, say crops are having trouble growing, or maybe there's a particular type of crop such as hay you're maybe having half the normal production by this time of year, then I might think, okay, maybe this is a short-term kind of agricultural drought. So we'll start looking at short-term precipitation indices and evaporative demand, some of our vegetation health indices, soil moisture models when starting the analysis. So once the map is completed and published for the week, it is final. So we cannot make any changes retroactively. So that's always been a policy for how the map is made and will continue to be. So again, once the map is released on Thursday morning, it is finalized. May have failed to mention before, but you'll also notice, maybe it's not exactly on here, but the map is also always going to be valid as of the Tuesday morning of the week of the Drought Monitor release. So there is a little bit of a lag in terms of when the map is valid and when it's released. That is to give the author time to look through the data and assign different categories Monday through Wednesday before it's released on Thursday morning, without new data coming in constantly through the whole process. So we'll get a bit into what just the process itself for an author looks like in a moment here. So yeah, how is this all done? So we currently have 10 USDM authors who cover page 1, that is the lower 48, Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico for the US Drought Monitor map. We're spread across multiple regional centers and agencies across the US. So we have one author at the Desert Research Institute, 3 here at the National Drought Mitigation Center in Lincoln, Nebraska, a couple authors at the NOAA National Centers for Environmental Information in Asheville, 3 authors at the Climate Prediction Center, and 1 author at USDA facility in Washington, D.C. So authors must work at a regional or national center, in a government or in an academia or research shop. There are currently 10 of us authors for page 1. All are volunteers. I did mention page 1, so there is a page 2, which we won't really get into in this talk, but please feel free to follow up with questions if interested. Page 2 of the map covers the US Virgin Islands and the US affiliated Pacific Islands, and we do have a few more authors who work specifically on that, as well as some who are shared between those 2 different tasks. So part of the US Drought Monitor process then involves collaboration between the national author for that week and local experts who are spread across the United States in different states. So right now we have an email list where people can submit drought impacts or drought monitor suggestions. Usually that's on a state-by-state basis. Oftentimes that's either a state climate office or maybe a National Weather Service office who are compiling their state level recommendations and sending that to us. So that'll always be sent to the US Drought Monitor listserv. And any drought discussion week to week can be done on this email list. If you'd like to sign up for this email list, please email my coworker, Brian Fuchs. You can see his email address here. His email will also be at the end of the presentation. So whenever we would be interested in making changes to how the US Drought Monitor works, we want that to be something that users want, or it needs to be desirable. It needs to be something that's sustainable from a business perspective. So we have to have time, people, money, resources to do that. And any changes that we make to the map, both in terms of maybe maps that we're showing, ways the data are broken down, different types of data that we're looking at on the map each week, all these things have to be feasible in order to do, but we're always willing to improve the process. So here's a little bit of a look then at what the process looks like each week. So this is from a map that looks like I did last year. So the data preparation will always start on Monday morning before we start making edits. So basically what's going to happen is you're going to take the previous week's map, and that'll be your starting point for the author. And then that'll be loaded into our GIS system. We use ArcMap right now. All of that data then, all of the different types of indices and indicators that we look at will then be downloaded from different from different sources. Again, for the US Drought Monitor, we're data users, not necessarily data creators, other than creating the US Drought Monitor product. So we're pulling in all these different types of data sets and then loading the percentiles of those into our GIS framework. And then we're looking at how do these updated percentiles for this week compare to last week's map and making adjustments accordingly over the span of a couple days. We're also taking into account suggestions from people on a state level who will implicitly also be taking into account impact reports from their states and helping us to kind of take a critical eye to the data. So again, when making the map, we're trying to look at the water cycle as a whole. So we're not just looking at incoming precipitation, but we're looking at how is that getting into soil moisture and groundwater? How is that impacting vegetation health? What are the effects of maybe atmospheric humidity on evapotranspiration, water loss from the surface? What are lake and reservoir levels doing? With really long-term droughts, you can see lake and reservoir levels obviously decrease significantly. That is something we account for. You also have, during the cold seasons, snowpack buildup in the mountains, and that can affect conditions both locally and remotely in terms of how waterways such as rivers flowing out of mountains are going to react to snow melt as you get into the warm season. So all of those different types of data sets we are looking at when making the drought monitor each week. So implicitly, we're looking at different timescales of data, different types of data. So a question that came up in the registration, I'm glad someone asked this. So how are we incorporating basically rapid drying or flash drought, or maybe extreme precipitation events into this? So again, incoming precipitation only tells one part of the drought story. So since we're trying to look at the whole water cycle, when we're looking at something like an extreme precipitation event that occurs over a few hours or part of a day, that's going to impact what our precipitation indices look at, which we certainly take into account. But we also need to see, how does that impact something like stream flow? Is that going to spike immediately and come back down? How is that impacting soil moisture? Did most of that water run off, or did it seep into the soils? How is that impacting groundwater, reservoirs, all these different things? So because we're not just looking at precipitation, but we're looking at a convergence of all of these different types of data sets, that's kind of how we try to account for basically extreme precipitation events, and if you're in a drought, how much those do or do not help the situation. Conversely, also in the last several years, we've had multiple different types of input data sets that have been developed that will help look at, say, flash droughts or rapid onset drought events. And those indices are specifically tuned to look for that. So again, finally, I just wanted to get into, when we're making the map, we're not only looking at different types of data in the water cycle, but we're also looking at the time periods that those different data sets are describing. So if I want to look at what is precipitation like over a long term, I might be looking out not just on monthly values, but also seasonal values, or even 1 or 2 or 3 year values for precipitation data sets when trying to analyze the situation, especially if it's an area that, say, has really low lake reservoir levels or groundwater issues. That might clue me into, hey, precipitation over the long term is really low. So then you look at percentiles of, well, how low is it? So, and so when we're trying to account for all of these different types of data sets, again, it's a lot of data that goes into one map. So all these different maps that you see on the screen gives you some idea of the different types of things we're looking at. Not all areas are going to be represented equally by all pieces of data. Some areas have more or less coverage of in situ data sets, such as point precipitation measurements, point temperature measurements. So again, you have to in some areas you have to rely a little bit more on remotely sensed data sets. Some areas you may be able to rely more on individual weather stations to get some of your precipitation and temperature data, for instance. So over the past 10 years, a number of satellite and remotely sensed space tools and products that show different parts of this water cycle have allowed new composite drought indicators to be developed. So a few examples of this, especially ones that look at can help look at short-term or rapid onset drought, include our evaporative stress index, or ESI, the evaporative demand drought index, or EDI, quick dry, the GRACE products, veg dry, and recently our forest drought index. So again, we have all these different kind of tuned drought indices that we've been developing recently or have had developed that we now pull in as authors. We're also looking at more high resolution here at the National Drought Mitigation Center. We're also looking at combined drought indicators, both for short-term analysis, long-term analysis, and flash drought that use different AI and machine learning techniques to pull in multiple different drought indicators and indices for one map to kind of help give authors an initial look at what is maybe a blend of short-term drought indices look like when you're starting to edit the map, or what is a long-term blend, or maybe what are different areas that you ought to look at for quickly developing or flash drought type of events. So this is an example of what one of our short-term drought index composite indices would have looked like from earlier this summer. And so again, you can see that this is showing a lot of short-term wetness across parts of the upper Midwest and northern Great Plains, but pretty strong dryness across parts of southeast New Mexico, southwest Texas before some of the heavy rain events. And you can see on here with the composition of this, the different inputs that go into the short-term CDI. Likewise, we'll go ahead and look at what the long-term CDI looks like. So this looks at different mixes of, say, what's called a standardized precipitation index, or SPI, or evapotranspiration index. Those are fancy ways of basically putting together precipitation data and precipitation and evapotranspiration data into different balances that combine basically precipitation and evapotranspiration for a certain time period, comparing to that same time period of the historical record. And then again, we have a CDI that's specifically tuned to flash drought that we've been developing as well. And so going into this, we have basically libraries of the different gridded data that we use to create and help train these different models. So this is an ongoing process that has both an operational and a research component to it. It is difficult to validate this because it is difficult to figure out exactly what we validate results against when we're developing this. It is difficult to have strictly reliable operational gridded data. That is increasing over time, though. So it is also not a 100% AI and machine learning process right now, as we are choosing potential inputs and periods of record in the data library for the development of these tools. We're determining what the training data is, and we're determining the bounds of the timescales utilized for the different blends. So in doing this, we can also account for non-stationary of climate or long-term climate change, both by defining the period of record that we're using for a specific indicator and defining what reference period we're using. So if you'd like to see any of these different data sets as they currently are, feel free to visit our blends website at ndmcblends.unl.edu. All right, so again, the process week to week, we'll take the previous week and then transition notes from the previous author to the new author. We'll download all of the input physical data that we're looking at on Monday and Tuesday. We'll start sending out drafts for the next week's Drought Monitor to that email listserv that I mentioned before. So then people can submit different ideas, changes they want to see to that. And then it's an iterative process where we weigh suggested changes, look at the evidence, create a draft, and then rinse and repeat the process, evaluate the results, download more data. And finally, by midday Wednesday, we're finalizing the map, sending the data to NDMC here, the technical team processing it, and we're writing a descriptive narrative in order to explain what conditions were over the last week and sometimes why specific changes were made. So in all of this, I want to quickly mention the role of drought impacts. So they're part of the puzzle for analyzing drought, but not the whole thing. So first, we want to basically provide evidence of what drought is going on in different areas. We want to alert authors to hotspots. So say if I'm looking at a set of drought impact reports and there's a bunch of them in maybe Northwest Missouri, I might start the week by looking at that specific area. I might spend Monday morning or Friday afternoon looking through Drought Monitor or drought impact reports and seeing, okay, what are some areas that I should focus on, combined with what did the previous author tell me, hey, maybe take a look at these areas first. And then again, people on a state level will also be looking through these drought impacts and helping to incorporate them. And they'll also have a better idea of how do these specific drought impacts in our local area that we know a little bit better than the national authors, how do they validate the physical indicators and indices that we have, or maybe do they not line up to those? And they can help us contextualize the different physical indicators and indices. Also, you can use them to identify the different types of droughts that you're looking at. So there are certain impacts that will be more associated with short-term drought in some areas, long-term drought in some other areas. So they also help us when we're drawing those impact lines on the map. And again, they can help contextualize different data sets that then assist in the drought severity classification, but impacts on their own will not change the map. So again, when you go through all the different types of indices and indicators that we pull in when doing the analysis each week, we can be looking at as many as 150 types of maps. And so again, there's, for the sake of time, we'll kind of move through this part a little bit quicker. But again, because of the breadth of the different types of data sets we're looking at, they're looking at different pieces of the water cycle. We are looking at hundreds of unique pieces of data from at least 25 products. And we also share these different data sets. So if you'd like to see what those look like each week, we do produce a PDF document. You can find that at droughtcenter.unl.edu, USDM weekly maps, and US_maps_current. So again, feel free to visit that, and I can send that out link in the question and answer sheet as well. So you can see the different types of data we tend to look at and how those change from week to week. So when we're going through the process again, as authors, we're sending out multiple drafts and adjusting the drought levels, severity, impact lines on each of the drafts, and taking feedback from people on a state and local level and adjusting each draft accordingly. So for those of you who are contributors on this list, who would like to be contributors, I want to run through kind of a list of what we want you to do and maybe not want you to do in doing this. And we really appreciate anyone who does submit suggestions each week. It is really helpful for us. So first, when you're sending contributions such as state level suggestions for the map or maybe regional level suggestions for the map, please send them to the whole listserv. So if there are maybe disagreements along a potential political boundary between you and a neighboring state, that'll help keep everyone in the loop on any discussions surrounding how to handle that well. When you're sending the emails, put the state or geographic area you're covering in the subject line. So for instance, if I'm printing off emails and organizing them and writing down lines, if say I'm near the end of the process on Wednesday and I get an email if I see an area, it's like, oh, it's from Texas or New Mexico, then I'll know, okay, I probably should run to that area right now rather than printing it off and risking missing what that is initially. So you also want to keep the total attachment size and just general computer stuff, the 2 millibars, not millibars, megabyte or less. Please include the most recent USDM map or draft so that we can see how your recommended placement of lines compares to what the most recent draft is. That assists in interpreting any draft suggestions that you provide. And then also, if you can include a summary of what the changes are and the justification by different data sets for any changes you made, that's really helpful for us so that we can understand and just what types of information you're looking at because of the attachment between the drought monitor and different, basically percentile ranges. In turn, as drought monitor authors, we like to say when we're sending out draft maps, we're also trying to show these are the types of data we were looking at in different areas too. So it can be a conversation back and forth. Finally, please don't share the map or narrative with anyone outside of the state monitoring team or on the national listserv until its official release on Thursday morning. So there is a moratorium on sharing this until Thursday morning when the map has been released to the general public. Please use local geographic features. Please do not use local geographic features when describing locations of changes as national authors unless we're specifically familiar with an area. If it's an area we lived in or used to live in, we're unlikely to know exactly where that is. Don't send large attachments. Try not to draw lines on other maps or products as that can get kind of noisy and make interpretation more difficult. And again, try to keep maybe input to bullet points rather than maybe long text descriptions. And finally, again, because we're looking at multiple types of data rather than just a few individual data sets when assigning convergence of evidence and evaluating that, try to look at a large suite of data rather than cherry picking just a data set or two when you're assigning different change levels. So again, kind of going through that again, we're looking for percentiles, impact information and how that aligns to percentiles. We don't, as authors, consider relief programs and other uses of the drought monitor map when we're assigning classifications. We usually only make 1 category changes per week. On somewhat rare occasions, we'll make 2 category improvements. That often occurs, maybe if you have a tropical cyclone and rain from that or something. We do want contributions during all seasons. That can be as simple as saying, we don't want any changes this week, here's why. Try to come to a state or regional consensus prior to sending recommendations, before sending us that information. And once we've published in that, again, changes won't be made retroactively. And we want to look at percentiles when assigning categories rather than individual data sets, such as maybe percentile of normal precipitation or percent of normal precipitation, which is not on its own a percentile. And we're not going to change the map based on impacts alone. We're not only focused on a single type of drought. And again, we also are looking at longer term changes. Precipitation does take time to move through the water cycle. If any changes aren't made a specific week, they can always be looked at next week. So again, week to week changes are somewhat limited, usually to 1 category in one direction. It's exceptionally rare to have any 2 category degradations. It's pretty rare to have 2 or 3 category improvements. Oftentimes your larger changes will be seen over longer periods of time over the span of a month or 2. Again, in order to make this process work, we really need all the physical data, the impact information, feedback from folks, then climate information and validation from people to have different authors pull in this information to make the map a successful product. And rather than looking at the end product, trust the process. For when we're making the USDM, all of us authors try to share the same methodology when we're doing that, which is one of the things that makes the US Drought Monitor process strong, is again, we're following the same methodology week to week, author to author. So moving forward, we're looking to have a data repository for all different types of weekly data that we're looking at as authors in GIS formats. We're working with different data providers on new indices and indicators that are being developed. We're continuing work on more objective composite drought indicators that will also be feeding into the USDM process each week. And we're looking at working with researchers and data providers to incorporate latest basic research into the different types of data that feed into the USDM process, again, it's a continuous development process. And finally, we're looking to develop a process for vetting potential data sets that we'd be incorporating as authors for the process. So for instance, if someone has, say at NASA or some other organization, has a drought index that they'd like us to look at for the drought monitor, we might have a webinar with them where they explain to us, hey, this is how this particular data set works. These are its strengths, these are its weaknesses. So as authors, we can evaluate that data and how we might use it. And in doing all this, we want to engage different stakeholders and users to better serve their needs. So just some final thoughts. There are a bunch of different ways that people can contribute to making the USDM map. That ranges from official participation in the draft and validation process on the listserv to contributing on the ground observations that Kelly Smith will be talking about in a little bit. We want you to use existing avenues to relay any information that you want relayed to us. Please understand that the programs triggered by the Drought Monitor were not intended to cover every drought episode, but only the worst of the worst conditions. We do anticipate disagreement with the map, especially on local levels. It is a weekly product. Week to week, we can continually adjust the map to reflect the data on the ground. And again, the drought monitor levels are validated by impacts and conditions observed on the ground. So, and we do make week to week changes based on all those different types of information. And this really is the gold standard for drought monitoring, not only in the US and around the world. But with that being said, we're always looking for ways to improve the USDM, both the process and the type of inputs that we're using when making the map. So with that, I thank you for your time and we'll happily take any questions.
If anybody has any questions for Curtis, you can go ahead and use the icon that says react on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And you can raise your hand, or if you want to type something in the chat box, feel free to do that as well.
I guess a few things to start with here. So maybe to get some ideas going here, I did want to mention a little bit more about, as we go into Kelly's talk, how we do have different citizen science initiatives that are incorporated into the US Drought Monitor process. So she'll be talking in the next talk about our Condition Monitoring Observer Reports, or CMOR. So, and that's the primary method by which we collect different drought monitor or different drought impact information, and people on a state level working at, say, National Weather Service or state climate offices, they'll be looking through those reports too. Anyone can submit those reports, and they by themselves won't change the US Drought Monitor, but we do look at them to contextualize the data. We also, as one of our data inputs, have recently been pulling in CoCoRa's precipitation reports. Those stations by themselves will not really change the map because they don't have long-term, because each of those individual stations don't have long-term periods of record that we can then robustly assign percentiles for what's the last month or two of precipitation compared to the whole historical record. However, in areas maybe when we're looking at different type of like gridded radar products, or maybe there aren't very many long-term precipitation recording stations from, say, the National Weather Service's cooperative observing network in an area, we will look at CoCoRa's data to kind of supplement what's going on. And maybe in looking at that data, we'll see, hey, this area got a bunch of heavy rain and maybe there were mountains blocking the radar beam, or the radar is too far away to really see what's going on. We can also use CoCoRa's data to, again, see if they're, again, based on maybe a radar beam and is too high in an area, there aren't a lot of other weather stations. We can maybe get an idea of what different biases in different areas might be. So again, citizen science is important for helping us contextualize other type of data in the drought monitor. Looks like we'd had another question come up from Sherry. What may be the cause for bullseye areas with either no drought or much lower or higher drought classifications? That's a good question. So, and when we looked at that map earlier in the presentation that showed parts of the West and Southwest as having a higher frequency of drought, I think what that shows is that maybe you are seeing in parts of the Western United States over centuries, you do sometimes see really long-term type of mega drought events. Some of that signal is maybe what you'd be seeing in that area right now. Also, long-term climate variability and change, you can potentially see that come out in how we analyze the map, insofar as if you have areas that are maybe getting drier or wetter over time, that's going to be reflected in the different drought indices and indicators that the author looks at each time. So, and I would really say it, what you're seeing for the bullseyes is just areas that we've seen more and less drought in the past couple decades. So. Yeah, thanks for asking that clarifying question, Brian. Is that for maps just any given week, or is that for the summary map? So.
Hey, I don't have a question, but I just have a comment to make. The biggest problem that I see from the general public and those that don't attend these state drought monitor meetings is just that folks are just uninformed on what the different classifications are.
Mhm.
And it's perfectly published right there on the Drought Monitor website. I mean, it's not a complaint of mine or anything.
Mhm.
It's just that most people don't know what percentile is for what category or intensity of drought.
Sure,
And
sure.
I don't know, I don't have a suggestion on how to inform people. I really don't. But I'm not sure if there's some sort of campaign that needs to be asked. But I don't know if there is a better way to publish that information, it would be great. And I think that
Yeah.
would get a lot of our upset people placated in some way.
Sure, sure. So yeah, thanks for the comments. And we do believe we do have a video tutorial and some about the USDM information also on the US Drought Monitor website. I don't have those links directly in front of me, but that could be information that you can share with people when you get any questions about that. And feel free to, yeah, and actually, Brian, thank you. He just posted that link in the chat. So anything that you took away from today's presentation, please feel free to share what the different ranges of percentiles are and how the map works with different people too. So, but then we can more widely publicize the online tutorial as well. So, and please feel free to share information like what you see in the tutorial. So.
Hey, Zach,
Curtis?
this is Brian Fuchs. And that question you bring up is really one of the biggest challenges we have associated with the drought monitor. And that's a continual outreach and education effort that needs to take place. Without adequate resources available to do that, it really is challenging to get that message out consistently, constantly. We've tried an bottom-up approach. We've tried a top-down approach, working with different agencies that do interact with people on the ground. And we do have some fact sheets and things like that, the link to the tutorial online. But again, a lot of times it's really this understanding, this deep dive into what's going on. And that's a challenge to communicate. So we do recognize that, and we are working to alleviate that, but it is a challenge, and it's an ongoing challenge because drought is impacting different parts of the country all the time. And people, maybe it's their first time being impacted by drought, et cetera. So it is a challenge, and thank you for bringing it up. And if you have ideas to how we can address this differently than what's been going on, we're all ears to that as well.
Yeah, thank you guys for your responses. Yeah, it's just a observation of mine, and just something that I keep in mind. And some of it's just emotional. It's just, yeah, as a human, I've even just looked outside, and after weeks and weeks of no rain, and I'm thinking to myself, like, man, we should be in D3 by now. This is ridiculous. And then I go back and look at the data, and it just doesn't support that. So it's a bit emotional, and it's not something that um, we can't always be looking at it from an objective point of view. So yeah, I don't know. It's just a conversation to be had, I guess.
See, Curtis, Mindy had a similar question up above, if you want to address that one too.
Sure, yeah, thank you. So Mindy asked, is there an easier explanation that we can give when we have producers challenging the drought monitor when they don't agree with it? Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think a way to maybe simplify the message a little bit, or at least start a more in-depth discussion, is again to frame the drought monitor as, and the different levels on the map, as showing how rare a drought event is, and that you can, yeah, I guess I would say you can have impacts that start to occur that can really have severe consequences on the economy and basically people's lives at lower levels than what maybe the higher categories that trigger different programs are. So again, it's the drought monitor, and well, the different programs associated with, like the LFP, for instance, that are associated with the drought monitor, are only built to cover the worst of the worst situations. And so again, it's maybe highlight the rarity of things like extreme exceptional drought, or having a long-term stay in a category like severe drought, can be important when trying to and show that, yeah, those are rare events basically. So
And so to add on to what Curtis just said, when individuals don't agree, we also make sure we emphasize that this is a national product. It's not for local. We can't analyze at the local level. So that's a lot of where disagreements say. They're like, well, you showed this in this county, but our county doesn't have that. Well, this analysis is a national analysis.
right, and to kind of run with what you just said, Lindsay, too, sometimes if we get information from a particular, like maybe the western corner of a county, we get a bunch of calls that say, hey, conditions are really severe in this part of the county compared to this other part of the county in these particular ways. I have gone, and either the next week I looked at it, and they were like, oh yeah, I can make a few more adjustments to that, or I'll put in, and going from one author to the next, my notes for them saying, hey, we were getting a lot of calls reporting this specific type of impact. in this more local area, maybe see if there's any more data you can dig into as to what's going on there. And sometimes, again, it is going to be that the data just don't bear out that conditions are as severe as people on the ground think they are. So,
Mindy, another option would be for producers. There are, for most states, there is a state level process of gathering information and collecting data that gets sent up to the authors. I would encourage local people, regardless of what state they're in, to reach out to who that local contact is. In many states, it's the state climate office. In some states, it's different from that. We could help with those connections, but sometimes states, when they're putting that together, and again, it could be at such a small scale that the data that we look at isn't showing a definitive signal there, but there are ways to communicate that information up to the map. Having individual producers call, hundreds at a time to the authors and tell them their displeasure with the map, that's not productive for anyone either. So we try to avoid that. And again, being involved with the Seymour reporting or COCORA's observing that we're going to hear more about, that's also a way that people can get involved so they can feel like they're more part of the process too.
And that would be great. I mean, if that's something that, because I hate to, when we have producers that come in, because again, those emotions do get in there and they're not agreeing with things. I mean, I don't want to encourage them to bombard you guys with all of the questions. And so if there's anything that we can do locally to try and again, part of it's understanding it better myself so that, we're able to explain it. But then, if the fact sheets are there or the contact for the climatologist, however, if that's something that's out there somewhere that you're able to direct us to, that would be great.
Yeah, Mindy, what state are you from?
Colorado.
In Colorado, so yeah.
Eastern Colorado.
The state climate office and the state climatologist with Russ Schumacher at Colorado State, we hear from them every week with guidance for Colorado. And I know that they used to have phone calls each week. I don't know if they have continued those, but there is a process that people can have their voice being heard on that local level if they're seeing something that they think is being missed. And again, the Seymour reporting is another way to do that, but definitely talking to Russ in Colorado, and I know he's the organizer of what we're hearing from the state. That would be a great first step. And he may have some suggestions for them too that, hey, this is what we're doing at the state level.
Perfect. Thank you.
And I see Russ's information got put in the chat, but that is available online. And for those in other states, most states have a point of contact like that too, that the authors are working with on a regular basis.
right. And what Brian said about it's a lot more productive for individual producers who have questions or concerns about the map to work and with people on their local and state level and to funnel that information through that climate office that also, because they're in that specific area, they may know more about what types of impacts may be associated with different levels of drought. They may know some nuances to how the water cycle in their areas work that as national authors, I may not know, or Brian may not know. So that's another reason, and we encourage people to work with people in their own local area. So is there a list of state contacts available? I don't know if there is or not. I'll go ahead and write that down.
Kathy, we do. I will share in the chat. The American Association of State Climatologists does have a website that has a listing to all the state climate offices. And 90% of the time, that is probably going to be who the point of contact will be. But in some states, there isn't a representative or somebody else is leading that effort, but it would be a good place to start. And if you run into process where you're not finding who that person is, you can reach out to us directly and we can put you in touch with them too. But I'll put that link for AASC in the chat.
I just put it up there for you, Brian.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Yep.
thank you, Brian and Tanya.
Yep.
Um,
Curtis, we should
yep.
probably move on to Kelly.
Yep. So
If you
Kelly,
folks have any more questions, please put them in the chat box and we will definitely try to get to them, or we'll answer them on that question and answer sheet that we send out later.
all right, so we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Kelly Smith. So she's the Assistant Director and Drought Impacts Coordinator here at the National Drought Mitigation Center. She'll be talking to you today about our Seymour drought system and how you can get involved in drought impact reporting. So Kelly, please feel free to.
Yes, thanks very much. I will share my screen. And I'm actually going to be talking about a few products related to drought impact monitoring. I just want to set the stage and say this is a little bit like tuning into something on a television. There are a lot of different ways to monitor drought impacts, and each one is kind of like its own channel. And I will mainly be focusing on two of the ways that we do here at the National Drought Mitigation Center. One is the Drought Impact Reporter, which is top down. It's a little bit, it's based on traditional media and scanning traditional media reports. And by that, I mean a system where there are people gathering news and editing news and kind of an attempt to ensure credibility and accuracy. There's a whole news gathering process. And that is the basis of the data that we're using for the Drought Impact Reporter. Then I'll also be talking about our condition monitoring observer reports. Condition monitoring reports are a little bit more like public access from the early days of cable. Anybody can get on and file a report, and it's a good way to aggregate information and make it visible to a larger public. And then one question that comes up a lot when I present on this is, what about CocoRa's? And I always say CocoRa's is a great program. Go to cocoras.org to learn more about it. The main difference between CocoRa's reports and Seymour reports is that CocoRa's is based on daily rain gauge measurements with your drought reports optional. And Seymour reports, we really encourage and facilitate photos, and we're looking more for weekly or monthly interaction. So there are a couple differences, but the Seymour reports grew up very much kind of with CocoRa's as a model. They're in the same family, and I know a lot of you are familiar with CocoRa's, and I do tell people absolutely that that's a very valuable contribution to the available drought data. So a key thing to mention is that drought impacts happen within sectors. It's normally about what are people trying to do with the water. Unlike drought itself, where you can just look at a blanket of assessment across the whole country, you know, where it didn't rain, where it wasn't hot. In this case, we're talking about how did it affect farmers, corn production, agricultural impacts, in-stream impacts. Can you do recreation? And of course, in-stream is also habitat for fish and wildlife. Then energy production is also a very important impact. And of course, water supply for people and general dry conditions. We see those a lot. These are just a few of the most frequently observed impacts. The Drought Impact Reporter is this is what it looks like. The default display of the Drought Impact Reporter is showing you the last 90 days of data entered. And you can see how we've broken it out by category. Agriculture and water supply are fairly prominent right now. Also fire. The fires being reported in the Northeast are a little bit unusual in our experience. And the default view is counties. We also collect impacts. We assign every impact sectors and locations, and the location can be a state, city, or county. Most impacts are counties, so the default view is county impacts. What I really want to show you about this is how data gets into the Drought Impact Reporter. We have a climatologist who is very dedicated. Her name is Denise Gutzmer. She is our lead drought impact moderator. She spends her days looking through the results of an automated news search that's been honed over the years to pull up drought impacts. When she finds an item that meets the definition of a loss or change at a specific place and time due to drought, she enters that into the Drought Impact database. And from there, it appears on a dashboard and a web app. One of the ways that this data in the Drought Impact database can be purposed, other than in the Drought Impact Reporter dashboard, is this state impacts table that we have on the US Drought Monitor site. Here we have matched drought impacts in the Drought Impact Reporter with drought monitor levels to say what impacts were happening in this example, it's Wisconsin. What impacts were happening in Wisconsin for agriculture at any level of the drought monitor categories, from D0, abnormally dry, through D4. And you can see that the search results are showing you several different impact categories at once. They all include agriculture because that's checked off, and other sectors that are also associated with those same impacts. So that is a very interesting application of drought impact reporter data, and it may be helpful within states if someone says, well, what does D2 mean and how does it affect water supply? This is where you can go to see what the answer to that has been in the past. We update this data every year, every, say, January, February, based on data from the previous calendar year, incorporating data from the previous calendar year. One point I want to make is that systematically gathered narrative data is not anecdotal. I hear that word a lot. I've seen it in the chat today, and sometimes people want to dismiss narrative data on the grounds that it is anecdotal. I would say that a story at a bar is a wonderful use of anecdotal data. Something you hear once, there may or may not be any context around it, but we're actually employing the methods of social science and being very systematic about how we gather this data. I wouldn't argue that one story isn't anecdotal, but when you look at the data as a whole, the way it's systematically gathered over time and categorized it allows you to look at a map and say, did an agricultural impact happen here, yes or no? And we bring some expertise to that. And sometimes within the news stories is really the only place that you know that drought is the cause of something, because they've interviewed a state climatologist or an FSA employee or a farmer to say, yeah, this is because of drought. This doesn't happen every year. So that is a particularly valuable component that comes from scanning the news. And I would also note that news is typically used, it's often used in historic research. It's also used can be used in a mixed methods process in order to identify issues that you then would want to go and systematically collect numeric data to make a decision about. You might, for example, have farmers saying the wheat crop is really bad this year because of drought. Okay, how bad? Well, then you start going and finding data on crop yield or collecting data if it doesn't already exist. So there are different stages of data collection, and the Drought Impact Reporter is based on this very broad narrative scan that lets you bring in all different kinds of impacts. Collecting numeric data requires a separate and concentrated effort. So don't dismiss it because it's narrative, just know how to use it. Put it in context. What else are people saying? And what other data can you collect to use to verify it? Now we're switching to condition monitoring observer reports, CMOR for short, that help us see more drought. This is what the default display looks like today. It's got year-to-date reports on it. You can see there's quite a bit of activity in the eastern part of the country. North Dakota is really good at submitting reports every single week, so you get a nice balance of dry and wet conditions there. And a lot of places are still very much kind of in a crisis-driven mode where you see these surges of reports when conditions start to dry out and people aren't sure where to turn. So CMOR is a system for collecting crowdsourced reports on drought-related conditions and impacts. We're using off-the-shelf Esri technology to gather and display reports, which has allowed us to evolve the system much faster than we could if we were using custom program. It also involves, it introduces some quirks to the process. The landing page that you can get to through this QR code or through this URL at the bottom has a whole lot of resources. They're designed to be very quick and easy to use to get you started. The first time that you submit a report on a mobile device, you're going to need to download the Survey 123 app from Esri, and then exit the app and download the survey. And it's actually easier than I'm making it sound, but you have to do the steps in the right order. It's just one of the quirks of the process. It allows you to bypass logging in, which would be functionally impossible with this system. So there's a lot of help out there. There are a few quirks to know about, but a lot of people manage to do this very successfully. So it is possible to get around the quirks and submit reports pretty easily. CMOR reports are a great way. I envision a triangle. Think about all the individual grassroots observers, Extension FSA filtering information up to their state assessment teams and then to US Drought Monitor authors. And we also do have an email newsletter. We try to get back to the observers, letting them know how their reports were used. But honestly, that detailed information would come better from states. And where we've really seen CMOR used most effectively is where states have embraced it as a way to gather reports and it does reduce the time spent on the phone with people. If everybody were calling and somebody were taking a message and trying to get it to the right person, that information does not get shared as widely as it does if it's entered into the CMOR database, where it's automatically shared. One of the things we really like to encourage is people submitting photos at regular intervals, such as weekly, of the same scene that allows us to compare different conditions in different years. We do have I believe we still have a regular observer from Greene County, South Carolina, who submits every single week. I think this person is an extension agent, but it really builds a nice record over time of what a particular landscape looks like. Because as we've mentioned, sitting here in Nebraska, we may be used to a browner landscape than in South Carolina. So if somebody sends us a photo from South Carolina, we don't really know how to gauge the color or the appearance. So it's, or from any other location, you know, if you're in the East, you may not be attuned to Western landscapes and so on. So what I want to do for most of the rest of the time is actually a live demo of how to report, of how to submit a report. My method is that I've got a spot about 5 miles away from my house. I ride my bike out there when I want to submit a report. It's a nice bike ride. I'm get some exercise, and I take pictures. There's a nice pasture where they raise bison at Pioneers Park. And so I take pictures of the pasture, and if I'm lucky, I get a bison in there. And then my dot appears on the map, which is always very gratifying. So we're going to try to make that happen in real time today. Whoops, sorry, I meant to switch on a PowerPoint. So I'm going to start from this landing page for the CMOR program. This is the one that I showed you that has all of the different resources on it. I'm going to go to submit a report. And this is what the report form looks like on a desktop. The first thing it does is ask if I'd like to switch language. I'm going to keep it in English, but this is where I would click this top left word, English, if I wanted to switch away from English. It's telling me it's currently in English. Then there's some boilerplate language telling you what this is and where to find my report after I have submitted it. Then I'm going to submit going to tell it what state I'm in. That would be Nebraska. My local jurisdiction, that would be Lancaster County. And you notice that the Where Are You module just went from pink to white when I submitted that. That's because it's got me located at a university VPN site that is within Lancaster County. But I'm going to show you what this looks like if I accidentally enter an invalid location. And by that, I mean a location that doesn't match the county above. So I'm going to say that I'm in Springfield, Missouri, which happens to be my hometown. And then it turns pink color and it says, attention, please place your location in the local jurisdiction selected. We actually got a fair amount of user error with this widget. We could tell it was easy to spot the ones that were in the middle of an ocean and relocate them to the correct county. It was much harder to spot ones that might be in the right state, but a county or two away. So that's why we've implemented this. And since I'm not reporting from my home or the location where I am, since that's not what my photo is of, I am typing in a location. In this case, it's Pioneers Park Nature Center. So that got me close. And then I'm going to click and drag to get to the loop where the bison enclosure is. And then I click on that map and it places a marker. And you can see that my location is no longer pink. I have successfully done that part of the module. So that's how that works. And my photo was taken today, this morning. How wet or dry is it? I'm going to exhibit my recency bias, even though I know we're officially in drought. I'm going to say we're near normal because we've had some pretty good rains lately. It's not as dusty as it's been. The road looked kind of wet when I was out this morning. So we don't really expect Seymour reports to match drought monitor status. We expect them to tell us what people are seeing now. Maybe at most they've got like a 10-day frame of reference for something like this. Then it asks me how much experience do I have. I'm going to say I've lived here a long time, 20 or more years. I've seen it like this a lot of times. When was it most recently like this? I can skip this question a lot of times. How localized or widespread? I think they're pretty widespread. Sometimes people want to tell us what's happening in one part of the county versus another part of the county. Today I'm reporting on normal or wet conditions. So I'm just going to say normal conditions for this time of year, which is a nice thing to be able to say. In the past, when I have made this particular report, I have gone to the recreation or tourism impact, and I say it's a less appealing landscape. That's one of the things that I observe when I'm out there. And you'll see my photos in a minute. So there are a number of different impact sectors that people can select. Agriculture and livestock get a whole lot of attention, and I certainly encourage people to go check these out, explore it. You can click on the survey if you want to explore it and not hit submit. That's absolutely a fine thing to do. Then I'm going to add some photos. Got one photo looking north over the pond. That's very small, I'm sorry. It'll upload at normal size. And another one that's looking west, and there are actually bison behind that tree that you can see if you look closely. Let me pull up my, and I kind of cheated and I pre-typed my description so that you wouldn't have to see me making typos. So I'm telling people that the photos are looking north over the pond. That's much fuller now than it was last time I was there, and west across the pasture with a bison behind the tree. And actually last time I was there, I reported that it was extremely dusty and there were a lot of grasshoppers. So there really has been a difference in the past month or two. I'm going to, it asks us to identify our role. You can check more than one. My role today is as an outdoor enthusiast, maybe a citizen scientist. A display name helps you find your reports on the map. It's like a username in a community platform that identifies you without necessarily identifying your name. I use a version of my name, Kelly Helm Smith, and then the asterisk ones, your name and your email. We don't actually display that publicly, although we retain that for use internally. And then I'm going to hit submit. And let's go see if we can find it on a map. Sometimes it's a little slow to load. I'm fingers crossed that it's going to work for us today in a quick fashion. The default custom date range is the past 2 days. So let's see if that will narrow it down for us in a hurry. I believe this green dot is me. Near normal, widespread. There are my photos. So I made them appear pretty quickly. So that concludes the live part of the presentation. Let me go back to PowerPoint. One final point related to Seymour is that if you are in a state and you want to use this system, you can tailor it to collect information like Montana does. They've tailored the language at the top. And you can also tailor a dashboard like the Caribbean does. It zooms in on a particular geographic area. And in this case, if you can see it, that it's actually in Spanish. So we can provide more information to you if you're interested in that. And that concludes my presentation on drought impacts. Thanks very much.